Capturing reflections on lakes and water is a very popular form of landscape photography. We've come down here to this lake in Italy to capture the reflection of this mountain in the background. The best time of day to shoot this is either early in the morning or late in the afternoon. We're about an hour and a half away from the sun setting, so the light is very soft. The background is illuminated, but the water, the lake in front, is not. This ensures that we don't get any reflections of the sun in the sky on the water, but we only get reflections of the mountain in the background. There's a few different styles of shooting this. You can do long exposure by using a stopper filter on your camera like I'm about to do, or you can do it without that at all. You can just set the aperture very narrow, or you might even want to freeze the movement on the water. You can also shoot when it's windy. Wind is going to cause ripples that go across the lake. It's a very small amount of wind here, but you can see that there's ripples across this lake. There's also a river feeding into it and out of it, so there's a gentle current as well. Or you can wait until there's no wind whatsoever, and you can have a crystal clear, pristine, flat water. You can also try and achieve the same effect by having a longer exposure. The setup is pretty simple. I'm using aperture priority mode here, set to f11, which is a popular aperture for landscape photography. I might adjust this later to f8, it depends on how long the shutter speed is going to be. I'm also using manual focus because it's a fixed composition. I can move this 10 meters up there and it's not going to change the point of focus in my scene. So I set the focus and I hit it to manual. So every time I go to take a photo, it captures it without trying to focus first. And that's very important if you're going to be using a stopper filter like I will in part of this video. The composition for this scene is fairly simple. I'm not trying to get too creative here. In fact, I'm going to cut the scene right in the middle. This is a pretty big no-no when it comes to any kind of composition for landscape photography. You would never want to put a horizon straight in the middle of the photo because it cuts it in half. However, in this scenario, the whole basis of the photograph is the reflection, and you want to have an equal part reflection to the mountains in the background. If you adjust the composition to 70-30 or 60-40, then you're really not capturing as much of that reflection as possible. In fact, if anything, I would want more reflection and less of the background. It does, of course, depend though on the angle of view of your lens. So throughout these shots, you're going to see that I'm shooting with the composition basically cut in half. But on a rare occasion, this actually works really well. You'll also notice that through the shooting process, I'm going to get lower to the ground with my tripod so that I can capture the reflection from a lower angle closer to the water, which will add to the effect. So I'm originally going to take this photograph without a filter on. I'm going to take this off, set it to f11, and I'm going to try and freeze the motion of the water, which is these little ripples, and I'm going to try and set my aperture very narrow so it's begging for more light, and it has maybe a 1 second exposure or maybe half a second exposure. We'll have to see what comes up here, and you'll see the difference between that natural blur and the sharpness in the water. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the filter to the scene, and you'll start to see that how the blur affects the image. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of massive amounts of blur in a photograph. I think it kind of takes away from the beauty of the scene, and it makes it more about this abstract effect that's going on and not the beautiful background and scenery. So let's start shooting and you'll see the effects that I'm trying to capture. I've taken both photos now. One was shot at 125th of a second in f8, ISO 320, just to get that boost of light. And the other one was shot at 1/10 of a second, so we get that sort of smooth blur that you'd find in a waterfall. That's how I like to capture waterfalls as well. And I actually set it to f22 and I turn the exposure down by 1 stop so that we can have that slightly longer shutter speed from 1/5 of a second to 1/10 of a second. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the filter to the end of the lens, and this is a 6-stop filter, so this is going to change the exposure by 6 stops of light. So we can actually measure that. If we test this now at f11, it's telling us, if I set the exposure to the center here, 1/20th of a second, maybe 1/15th of a second. And then as I add this onto the end, it's now telling us 2.5 seconds. So that's 6 stops of light that's changed here. The great thing about manual focus here is it's going to really struggle if you have a filter on the end because you're blocking out so much light. So if you set manual focus with the filter off, you can add it in and not have to worry about that. You can certainly see here that by having a longer exposure and smoothing out that water, the reflection is much more prominent in the scene, which is what we want to try and achieve here. And a 2.5 seconds seems to work about right, because if it was much longer, it would be a very smooth blur, whereas here we still see some of the shapes of the ripples. I'm going to get a little bit lower with my tripod now and shoot it again. The perspective here hasn't changed all that much by going about 3 or 4 feet lower, but what has happened is I've managed to get the angle of these ripples from a lower angle, which creates a slight difference in the blur. Having this longer exposure of 2.5 seconds seems to be working really well, but I'm also going to experiment with around 1 second and around 4 seconds to see how that looks in this scene too. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase my ISO. We're now at 250 from 100. And that's a 1 second exposure. And then I'm going to decrease the ISO back down to 100 again, and I'm going to change the aperture to f14 for a 4 second exposure. And let's review. This all comes down to personal taste, but personally I think the 1 second exposure looks a lot better than the 4 second exposure, because at 1 second the reflection is much stronger. However, you still get the shape of some of those ripples in the water. So it almost doesn't even look like it's a long exposure. It looks like it's just a very, very soft wind passing over the lake here. So I think that's probably my favorite shot here. The filter has been very beneficial to the results of this photograph, but I found that even if I take the filter off and I set my aperture to f22 and ISO 100, and admittedly I have to turn up the exposure compensation by 1 stop, I'm getting a ½ second exposure here, which is going to allow me to capture very similar motion blur to the 1 second exposure. And you don't have to invest the money on a filter if this is not something you're going to be doing regularly. It's certainly slightly overexposed, but it's nothing I can't fix later when it comes to processing this photo in Adobe Lightroom. And as I'm shooting in RAW, all of my photos will be processed anyway. Even just minimal edits will make a huge difference. To summarize, to get the best results of lakes and water reflections in landscape photography, you need to shoot either early in the morning or late in the afternoon, avoiding direct sunlight on the lake. The lake is going to act as a mirror, and you want that to mirror the background, the mountains or whatever it is you're shooting. If the sun is shining off that, you're not going to be able to capture that very well. You also don't need to have a filter if you are shooting late in the evening and early in the morning, because there's much less available light. I'm using a filter, and it's great if you have one, but it's not essential. For the shutter speed, which is a very important factor of this exposure, obviously, I still shoot in aperture priority mode, and I tend to adjust the exposure compensation meter because I want to make sure my aperture is set, and I can adjust the ISO and exposure compensation meter independently from that. The shutter speed that you do use really depends on the shooting conditions. Here we have a current flowing through the lake, and we also have some wind. So I wanted to minimize that by having a longer shutter speed. If you have plenty of light and you don't have any movement or ripples on the water, you can have a much faster shutter speed. In this shooting situation, we found that anywhere from about ½ second to 2.5 seconds works great, but you can go for longer if that suits your taste. So that's how to shoot reflections on lakes and water for landscape photography. Thanks for watching.